You know that feeling when you walk into a room and everyone goes quiet for a second too long. That's exactly what happened the morning Sergeant Myra Vance stepped onto Fort Halden for the first time. I was there, I saw it. I'm telling you this because most of what got written in the official reports left out the parts that actually mattered. The parts about the people, about what a man's pride can cost when he mistakes silence for weakness. Let me start from the beginning. It was a Tuesday in late October, the kind of cold morning where your breath hangs in the air for a second before disappearing, and the grass on the parade ground is still crunchy with frost. Fort Halden sits up in the high country near the northern border, surrounded by pine forest and ridgelines that catch the wind year-round. You hear the wind before you hear anything else there. It comes down through the trees like it's looking for something. I was a corporal back then, 26 years old, 3 deployments behind me, stationed at the base as part of the rotational security detail, nothing fancy. I worked the comms hut on the east side, and most mornings I'd grab my coffee from the mess and walk the long way around just to get some fresh air before sitting down for an 8-hour shift staring at screens. That morning I was crossing the lot near the admin building when the transport pulled in. Standard green truck, 2 doors slammed, and out stepped this woman. She was small. That's the first thing I remember thinking. Not weak small, just compact. Maybe 5'5" if she was wearing her boots right. Dark hair pulled back tight under her cap. Pale skin from too many winters indoors. She didn't have that swagger you sometimes see with new arrivals trying to figure out where they fit. She just stood there, looking at the building, holding her duffel like it weighed nothing. And she had eyes that I can only describe as still, like a lake with no wind on it. I didn't know her name yet. I didn't know anything about her. But I remember thinking this one's seen things. The base commander at Fort Halden was Brigadier General Roland Cassick. I want to tell you about him because you can't understand what happened later without understanding him first. Cassick was 61 years old, career man, the kind who'd built his whole identity around the uniform he wore. Tall, broad in the shoulders, with white hair he kept high and tight even though no one was making him anymore. His face had that permanent sunburn look that men get when they've spent decades outdoors yelling at people. He walked with his chest out and his chin up, and his voice carried across a parade ground without him even trying. People respected him. I'll give him that. He'd earned a chestful of ribbons in his early years, and he knew how to run a base. The trains ran on time, as they say. But here's the thing about Cassick. He had a way of looking at people, a way of measuring them up in about 2 seconds and deciding what category they belonged in. And once he'd put you in a category, that was it. You weren't moving out of it. He'd been on his 3rd marriage. His sons didn't talk to him. He kept a bottle of bourbon in his desk drawer that everyone pretended not to know about. And he had this thing about women in combat roles. He didn't say it out loud, not in front of the wrong people, but you could tell. The way his jaw tightened when one of them spoke up in a briefing. The way he'd nod without listening. He was old guard, that's what we called it, old guard. So when Sergeant Vance walked into his office that morning to report in, I can only imagine what went through his head. I wasn't in the room, but Lieutenant Park was, and he told me about it later over beers. Said Cassick barely looked up from his desk. Said he made her stand at attention for a full minute while he finished reading some memo, and then he asked her to confirm her name and unit like he hadn't already read it. "Myra Vance," she said, "reporting as ordered, sir." He looked her over. Park said you could see it, the little flicker of dismissal, the way he sat back in his chair and let his eyes settle on her in a way that wasn't quite right. "You're the marksmanship instructor they sent me." "Yes, sir." "Huh." That was it, just huh, like he'd been expecting someone else and got her instead. He told her she'd be working with Range 4, training the newer recruits in long-distance shooting. Standard stuff. He told her to keep her head down and follow the chain of command and not to make waves. And then he said something that Park said he'd never forget. He said, "Sergeant, this is a quiet base. I like it quiet. You understand me?" She said, "Yes, sir. Don't try to prove anything to anyone here. Nobody's interested." And she said, "Understood, sir." Park said she didn't blink the whole time, didn't look away, didn't shrink, just took it. The first week, nobody really knew what to make of her. She kept to herself, ate alone in the mess, ran in the mornings before anyone else was up, the same loop around the perimeter every day in any weather. She didn't talk much. When she did, her voice was low and even, and she chose her words like they cost money. The guys at Range 4 started calling her the ghost behind her back. Not in a mean way. Just because she'd appear out of nowhere, give a quiet correction, and then drift off again. But here's what they noticed. The recruits started getting better, fast. There was this kid, Private Lowell, who couldn't hit a barn from the inside of it when he first arrived. After 2 weeks with Sergeant Vance, he was grouping shots tight at 600 meters. Everyone was asking what she was doing differently. He just shrugged and said, "She told me to stop thinking, to just breathe." That was it. That was the whole secret, apparently. But you could see it in how he stood now, how he held his weapon. There was a calm to him that hadn't been there before, like she'd given him a piece of something she had inside her. I met her properly about 10 days in. I'd been sent to deliver some encrypted comms gear out to Range 4, and I caught her at the end of a session. The light was that washed-out gray you get in late autumn, and her squad of recruits was packing up. She was standing at the edge of the firing line, watching the tree line, just watching, like she was reading something the rest of us couldn't see. I walked up and saluted. "Sergeant, got that gear from comms." She turned, looked at me, nodded. "Thanks, Corporal." She glanced at my name patch. "Raise." "Yes, ma'am." She helped me carry the gear over to the equipment shed, which surprised me. Most NCOs at her level wouldn't have. We walked in silence for a minute. Then she said, "How long you been at Halden?" 8 months, ma'am." "You like it?" I thought about that. It's quiet. She smiled, just barely. The corner of her mouth lifted maybe 1/4 of an inch. "That's what they tell me," she said. There was something in her voice when she said it, a flatness, not bitter, just tired maybe, like she'd heard the word quiet used as a warning enough times to know what it really meant. "I want to tell you something I learned later, not all at once, in pieces over months." Sergeant Vance had served in 3 conflict zones before Fort Halden. She'd done a tour with a long-range reconnaissance unit in country I'm not going to name. She had confirmed kills at distances most shooters can't even imagine. There was a story floating around about a sniper duel she'd been in, where she'd lain in the same position for 31 hours, not moving, not eating, barely breathing, waiting for her counterpart to make one small mistake. And he did, and she didn't. She'd been awarded medals she never wore. She'd been written up in classified after-action reports that only a handful of people had clearance to read. And then, 6 months before she arrived at Halden, something happened on her last deployment. Something nobody would talk about. She'd come back, taken a leave, and been quietly reassigned to a training role at a remote northern base. That was Halden. You see, when General Kasich looked at her that first morning and dismissed her in his head, he was looking at a file that had been carefully sanitized. He saw marksmanship instructor and a short list of unremarkable assignments. He didn't see the real record. He didn't have the clearance. He had no idea who he was talking to. Now I have to tell you about the dinner. 3 weeks after Sergeant Vance arrived, the general hosted his monthly officers' dinner. Big formal thing. Mess dress. Linen tablecloths in the officers' club. The kind of evening where senior staff would gather around the long table and Kasich would hold court at the head of it, telling stories from his early career, making sure everyone laughed at the right moments. NCOs weren't usually invited, but for some reason that month he'd extended invitations to a few of the senior sergeants, including Vance. Park told me later it was because Kasich wanted to size her up in a social setting, some kind of test. I was working comms that night, but I heard about what happened from 3 different people, and the story matched up, so I'm fairly sure of the details. Vance arrived right on time, wore her dress uniform, sat where she was told to sit, which was about as far from the general as he could put her without making it obvious. The dinner started. Drinks flowed. Kasich was in fine form, telling some long story about a training exercise from 20 years ago, with all his colonels laughing in the right places. And then, around the 3rd course, he turned his attention to her. "Sergeant Vance," he said, loud enough for the whole table to hear, "how are you finding things at Range 4? "Good, sir. The recruits are coming along." "Are they?" "Yes, sir." He took a slow sip of his wine, looked at her over the rim of the glass. "You know, I've been doing this job a long time, and I've seen a lot of instructors come through here. Some of them think they can teach what they've never really lived." The table got a little quieter. She said, "Yes, sir." He said, "What I mean is, Sergeant, marksmanship isn't a classroom subject. You can't fake it. You can't read about it in a manual and then show up here and expect men who have been in the field to learn anything from you." The room had gone fully silent now. Every officer at that table was suddenly very interested in their plate. Vance didn't move, didn't react. She just held his gaze across the table. "I understand, sir," she said. He smiled, the kind of smile that isn't really a smile. "Do you, though?" "I believe so, sir." He set his glass down. "I'm just saying, Sergeant, this is a serious place. We train serious men for serious work. I'd hate to see anyone undermine that by being put in a role they aren't suited for." There was a moment then. Park described it to me later. He said it was like the air got thick. He said Vance just sat there, her hands folded in her lap, her face completely composed. And then she said something I want you to remember. She said, "Sir, with respect, I'm exactly where I'm meant to be." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue. She didn't smile. She just said it. And then she went back to her meal. Kasich stared at her for another second. Then he laughed. A short, dismissive laugh, the kind that's meant to put someone in their place by treating them like a child. "We'll see," he said. And the dinner moved on. But here's what I keep thinking about, all these years later. In that whole exchange, she never once told him who she was. She never mentioned a single mission. She never hinted at a single thing in her real file. She just sat there and let him say what he wanted to say. Because that's who she was. She didn't need to be seen. She didn't need to prove anything. That's what real ones are like. The ones who have actually done it, they don't talk about it. They don't have to. The loud ones, the chest thumpers, the men who will tell you about their kills over a beer, most of them are lying or exaggerating. The real shooters, the ones who have laid in the dirt for days waiting for one breath to settle wrong on a man 6 football fields away, they're quiet. They walk into rooms and you don't notice them until they want you to. Sergeant Vance was one of those. And General Kasich had absolutely no idea. That night after the dinner, I was finishing my shift at comms. The base was quiet. The wind was coming down off the ridges the way it always did, that low howling sound that you stop hearing after a while because it's just always there. I saw her walk past the comms hut, heading back toward the barracks. She was alone. Her hands were in her jacket pockets. She was looking up at the sky, which was unusually clear that night. You could see the stars. She stopped for a second, just stood there looking up. I don't know what she was thinking about. I never asked her, but I remember the way she looked. Not sad, not angry, just somewhere else. Then she kept walking and disappeared into the dark. 3 days later, the first thing happened that made me realize Fort Halden wasn't going to stay quiet much longer. A patrol on the western perimeter found tracks in the snow. Not animal tracks, boot prints, coming down off the ridge, circling the outer fence and going back up into the trees. Whoever made them had been careful. They'd stepped only on rocks where they could. They'd avoided open ground. They'd known what they were doing. Kasich was briefed. He shrugged it off, said it was probably hunters who'd gotten too close, said to increase patrols but not to make a big deal of it. That's the kind of mistake that costs people their lives. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you what happened next, the week after those boot prints showed up. The temperature dropped. I remember because the pipes in the comms hut froze on a Wednesday morning and we had to run a portable heater under the desk all day. The kind of cold that gets into your bones and stays there. Sky the color of wet concrete. Snow coming down in fits, not enough to stick properly, just enough to make everything look smudged. Sergeant Vance kept doing her morning runs, same loop, same time. Only now I noticed something different. She'd stop at certain points, not for long, maybe 10-15 seconds. She'd stand at the corner of the southern fence and look up toward the tree line. Then she'd start running again. Same thing at the gap between the motor pool and the supply depot. A pause, a look, a continuation. She was reading the ground. I didn't understand it at first, but once I did, I couldn't unsee it. She was building a map in her head. Lines of sight, blind spots, places where someone could approach without being seen. Nobody had told her to do this. It wasn't her job. Her job was range 4. But she was doing it anyway, because that's just what she was. Lieutenant Park came by the comms hut on a Thursday with a thermos of coffee and a look on his face. Got a minute, raise? For your coffee, sir, always. He poured me a cup, sat down on the spare chair, stared at the screens for a while without saying anything. Then he said, "Did you hear about the Ridge cam?" "What about it?" "Went dark last night, around 0300. Tech says it's a wiring fault, says he'll have it back up by tomorrow." I looked at him, "And you don't believe it's a wiring fault?" He shook his head slow. "That camera's been there 4 years, never had a problem. And now, 3 days after we find boot prints on the perimeter, it goes dark." "You told the general." "He doesn't want to hear it." I sipped my coffee. The wind was rattling the panel on the side of the hut. "What's he saying?" Park gave me a tired look. "He's saying it's a quiet base." That phrase, quiet base. He used it like a shield, like as long as he kept saying it, nothing could happen. But here's the thing about quiet places. Quiet doesn't mean safe. Sometimes quiet means nobody's looking. Sometimes quiet means whoever's coming has all the time in the world. I want to tell you about a small moment that happened around then, because it stuck with me. I was in the mess hall, finishing up a late lunch. The place was nearly empty. Just a couple of mechanics from the motor pool eating in the corner, and Sergeant Vance sitting alone by the window, her tray pushed aside, a small notebook open in front of her. I went over, asked if I could sit. She looked up, considered, then nodded. I sat down across from her. She closed the notebook but didn't put it away. "How's the range?" I asked. "Same. Recruits behaving. They're learning." We sat there for a minute. I could see, through the window, the western fence and the trees beyond it. The light was already starting to fade, and it wasn't even 3 in the afternoon. I don't know what made me ask it. Maybe the coffee. Maybe Park's worried face from that morning. I said, "Sergeant, can I ask you something?" She nodded. "You ever feel like something's off on this base?" She didn't answer right away. She looked out the window. The wind was pushing the tops of the pines around in a slow rocking motion. Then she said, "Corporal, I always feel like something's off. That's not the base, that's me." I waited. She said, "But yes, something is off." I didn't know what to say to that. I think I just nodded. She tapped the cover of her notebook with her finger, once, twice. Then she said, "Keep your radio close at night. If something happens, don't wait for orders. Get to comms and lock the door. Sergeant, just do it, Corporal, please. There was something in her voice. Not fear, not even worry exactly. It was something quieter than that. Something like a person who already knows the ending of the story and is just waiting for everyone else to catch up. I said, "Yes, ma'am." She stood up, picked up her tray, and walked out. Now I need to tell you who they were, the men who came. I didn't know any of this at the time. Some of it I learned in the after-action briefings. Some of it I pieced together from intelligence reports that crossed my desk months later. Some of it I'll never know for sure. There were 7 of them. They weren't a uniformed force. They weren't a national army. They were a private contractor element, what people sometimes call mercenaries when they want to be dramatic about it. Highly trained, mostly ex-special forces from 3 different countries. The kind of men who got paid in cryptocurrency to do jobs that governments didn't want their fingerprints on. What they wanted from Fort Halden was specific. There was a vault on the base. A small one in the secure wing of the admin building. It held a set of communications encryption keys for a regional intelligence network. Those keys were rotated every 90 days, and we were 5 days away from the rotation. Whoever had those keys for those 5 days could read traffic that wasn't meant to be read. Someone had paid these men a great deal of money to get into that vault. They'd been watching the base for at least 2 weeks. They knew the patrol patterns. They disabled the ridge cam. They'd mapped the response times. They had a plan. The plan was a snatch and grab. Late at night when the base was at minimum staffing. Hit hard, hit fast, in and out in under 15 minutes. Their plan accounted for everything they knew about Fort Halden. It just didn't account for Sergeant Myra Vance. It happened on a Saturday night. It's important that I tell you it was Saturday because that detail mattered. Kasich had given a half-day stand-down. Most of the off-duty officers had taken the truck into town for dinner and drinks at the one decent bar within 40 miles. The base was running on a skeleton crew, maybe 30 active personnel on site. The rest were either in the bar, asleep in the barracks, or rotating through their down cycle. I was on shift in the comms hut. My partner that night was Specialist Diaz. She was new, only on base about 3 months. Good kid, quick learner. We had the heater going full blast because the temperature outside had dropped to single digits. The first thing I noticed was the radio. Around 22:45, the South Gate stopped responding to check-ins. It wasn't unusual for there to be a delay sometimes. Cold weather did things to the equipment, so I gave it 5 minutes, tried again. No answer. I called the corporal of the guard. He said he'd send a runner. The runner never reported back. That was when I started to get the feeling in my stomach. The one you get when something is wrong but you don't know what yet. I was reaching for the radio to call the duty officer when the lights went out. The whole base. Pitch black. The backup generator should have kicked in within 10 seconds. It didn't. Diaz said, "What the hell?" I grabbed the field radio off my belt. It still had power. The base network had its own emergency batteries. I keyed it. Comms hut to duty officer. We have a power failure. Comms hut to duty officer respond. Static. I tried again. Nothing. The radio was dead. Then I heard the first gunshot. It came from the direction of the South Gate, a single shot, then a pause, then a burst. Diaz's face went white. Oh my God. I grabbed my sidearm, checked the chamber. My hands were steady, which surprised me. I'd never been in combat before. I thought I would freeze, but my hands were steady. I said, "Get under the desk. Lock the inner door. Do not open it for anyone unless they give the day code." She said, "What about you?" I said, "I have to find out what's happening." I'd remembered just then what Vance had told me. Get to comms and lock the door. I was already at comms. I had to do the next best thing. I had to find her. I slipped out the back of the hut and into the dark. The base looked completely different without lights. I'd walked those paths 1,000 times, but in the blackness, with the moon hidden behind clouds, everything felt strange, bigger, quieter, except for the wind. And then more shots. This time from the direction of the admin building. I ducked behind the supply depot wall. I could hear voices. Men moving, not shouting, moving with purpose. They were speaking in low tones in a language I didn't recognize. I counted 2 voices to the east, 1 to the north. There were more. I thought about Park. I thought about Diaz back in the comms hut. I thought about the off-duty officers in the bar in town, 40 minutes away, who couldn't help us even if someone managed to call them. That's when I heard the general. He was in the admin building. His voice, muffled but distinct, came through one of the side windows. He was talking to someone, and his voice was different than I'd ever heard it. It had a strain in it I hadn't thought it could have. I crept closer, stayed low. I could see, through the window, the silhouettes inside. The general was on his knees. There were 2 men standing over him. One of them had a long weapon slung over his back. The other was holding a pistol against the general's temple. A 3rd man came out of the inner office, holding a small case. He nodded. They had the keys. The man with the pistol leaned down to the general. I could just barely hear him through the glass. He said in heavily accented English, "Stay down, stay quiet, no one's coming to save you." And then he laughed. I'll never forget that laugh. He laughed like he already knew how the night was going to end. He shouldn't have laughed. What I'm about to tell you, I didn't see all of it directly. Some of it I pieced together from her own short account afterward, and some from the team that went up the ridge the next morning to recover the bodies. But I want to tell it the way it happened, as best I can. Sergeant Vance had been in her bunk when the power went out. She told the investigators later that she'd been awake, reading. She said she'd had a feeling all that day, a feeling like the air pressure had changed. When the lights went out, she didn't waste time. She went to her locker. She pulled out the case that nobody had ever asked about, the one she'd hand-carried with her from her last duty station. Her rifle. A bolt-action, heavily modified with a scope that had cost more than my truck. Personal weapon, registered, fully authorized. Most of us had wondered why an instructor needed a rifle that expensive. Nobody had asked. She also pulled out a ghillie suit, a small ranging kit, and a comms earpiece on her own private frequency. By the time the first shots were fired at the south gate, she was already moving. She didn't head for the admin building. She didn't head for the comms hut. She went up. There's a water tower at the northwest corner of Fort Halden. It's not the highest point on the base, but it has a clear line of sight across most of the inner compound. The ladder up the side is exposed, but in the dark, with no lights, you wouldn't see someone climbing it unless you knew to look. She climbed it in under a minute. She set up at the top on the small maintenance platform, lying flat. She pulled the ghillie hood over her head. She steadied her breathing. And then she started to count them. This was the part the investigators couldn't believe later. She picked them out, one by one in the dark from over 400 meters away, with no thermal optic, just a night vision scope and her own eyes and her own breathing. She found their positions. She marked them. She waited. She was looking for the 7th man. You see, she'd done enough reconnaissance in her career to know that you don't move into a target like Fort Halden with 6 men. You move in with 7. There's always one on overwatch, one who isn't in the building, one who's holding a long gun on the high ground, watching everyone else's back. She had to find him first. Because the moment she fired, every other man on that base would be looking for the source of the shot, and the overwatch sniper would be looking hardest. If she got that man wrong, she'd be dead before her second round was chambered. She found him on the southern ridge. 1,200 meters out, maybe more. Lying in a hide he'd built himself with a clear view of the admin building. He'd been there for hours, probably, patient, cold, professional. He'd done everything right. He'd just done it against the wrong woman. She told the investigators later that she'd taken her time on that shot. She said she had to. The wind was coming down off the ridges in gusts, and the temperature differential between her position and his was substantial, and the air was thin at that altitude in a way that affected the bullet drop. She said she watched him for almost 3 minutes before she pulled the trigger. She said she watched his breathing. She said when he exhaled, she could see the small puff of fog from his mouth, even at that distance through her scope. And on his next exhale she fired. The shot cracked across the base like the sky had split open. I was crouched behind the supply depot wall when I heard it. I didn't know what it was at first. It didn't sound like the other gunfire. It was bigger, cleaner. A single sharp report that echoed off the buildings and rolled up into the trees. I heard one of the men, inside the admin building, shout something in his own language. I heard another shout back. And then the second shot came.